Canal 34, por cierto, muy popular.
Welcome back to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Juan Gonzalez. Lalo Guerrero singing Homenaje, Rubén Salazar, a tribute to Rubén Salazar, one of the best-known Latino journalists of the 20th century, one of the few journalists killed while reporting in the United States. This Sunday marked the 40th anniversary of his death. Rubén Salazar was killed on August 29, 1970, when he was struck in the head by a tear gas projectile fired by a sheriff's deputy into a bar during a massive anti-war protest that he was covering in East Los Angeles. He was just 42 years old. Salazar instantly became a martyr for the Chicano civil rights movement and a lasting inspiration for a generation of Latino journalists. Parks, schools, scholarships, and a U.S. Postal Service stamp bear his name. 40 years after his death, questions still remain about how he was killed. Today, we remember his life and legacy. Salazar was a correspondent for the Los Angeles Times and in Mexico City and Vietnam. In 1969, he returned to Los Angeles as the Chicano civil rights movement was in full swing. In January 1970, he left the LA Times for Spanish-language station KMEX. In his last televised interview, filmed just 3 months before his death, Salazar explained why he made the transition. He was interviewed by Bob Navarro of KNXT on May 13, 1970.
Here you were at the Los Angeles Times, large metropolitan daily and newspaper with an international reputation, riding a crest of a career. All of a sudden, you leave the Times, you go to Channel 34, like I said before, a Spanish-speaking station, a UHF to boot. Why?
I wanted to really communicate with the people about whom I had been writing for so long. And at the Times, I was doing, I think, a job that had to be done, and that is communicating with the establishment about our problems. But I wanted to try my hand at communicating with the Mexican-American community directly and in their language.
While Rubén Salazar quit his job as a reporter for the LA Times, he agreed to write a weekly column for the newspaper on Mexican-American issues. Here again is Bob Navarro questioning Rubén Salazar.
But it seems to me that you're leaving a position as a reporter who should be, quote, objective, and venturing into an area of advocacy.
Objectivity is impossible. And I don't think there's a newsman alive who really thinks that objectivity is the name of the game in the news media.
But is advocacy the name of the game? Can you work as a functional day-to-day reporter in the position of advocacy?
I'm only advocating the Mexican-American community, just like the general media is advocating, really, our economy, our country, our way of life. So I'm just advocating a community within a community, which, by the way, the general community has totally ignored. And so someone must advocate that. Because it's easy for the establishment to say, aren't we all the same? Aren't we all Americans? Well, obviously we're not. Otherwise we wouldn't be in the revolutionary process that we are in now.
Rubén Salazar also talked about what he saw was the role of the press.
Are we as bad as so many people are telling us? I'm talking about the press.
I think the press should be examined much more closely. And
by whom?
By everyone. Somebody should review us and tell us what's
Should the
wrong.
Government review us?
Well, of course not. The government has no business telling the press what they should. I mean, they should tell us what they think, but they certainly should not try to intimidate us. They don't want the press to rock the boat, and I think the press's obligation is to rock the boat.
Those clips courtesy of the documentary short Since Salazar by filmmakers Alani Montes and Victoria Fong. 3 months after that interview, Rubén Salazar was covering the National Chicano moratorium against the Vietnam War, a massive anti-war march that drew some 30,000 people to Los Angeles' east side. Police clashed with the marchers and fired tear gas into the crowds. Rubén Salazar was there covering it all. After several hours, he decided to take a break at the Silver Dollar Bar with his KMEX team. A sheriff's deputy fired a tear gas canister into the bar. It struck Rubén Salazar in the head, killing him. For 40 years, speculation and controversy have swirled around what happened. the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department is now considering releasing thousands of pages of official documents that could shed light on Salazar's slaying. For more on the life and death of Rubén Salazar and on the Chicano moratorium, we're joined by three guests. Felix Gutierrez is a professor at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California. He joins us from Los Angeles. Joining us on the telephone is Rodolfo Acuña, a professor emeritus of Chicano Studies at California State University at Northridge. He's the author of 21 books, including Occupied America, A History of Chicanos. And Robert Lopez is an investigative reporter at the Los Angeles Times. He has been investigating Rubén Salazar's death, and his latest article offers new insight about the contentious relationship between Salazar and Los Angeles police in the months before he was killed. We welcome you all to Democracy Now! I'd like to start with Felix Gutierrez of the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. Felix, if you can, tell us a little bit about the importance of Rubén Salazar and his early career, especially for the Southern California community, but for Latinos around the country.
Well, Rubén Salazar really had no equal in American journalism, in that he was a Latino working in general circulation media, general audience newspapers at a time when very few of us were found there. He started out in El Paso in the early 1950s when he graduated from Texas Western College, then works in Northern California in the late mid-1950s, and comes to Los Angeles in 1959 and ends up at the Los Angeles Times. There were Latinos working in the media, but they weren't working in covering our community. And he, for the first time that I can determine, did a series of articles that looked at East LA, which is the Mexican part of town in those days, with more compassion, with more interest, developing our own sources. We used to have a saying in those days that the reporters got into the community, into the barrio, right after the police. And unless there was some kind of a problem or issue or law enforcement thing, you just didn't see journalists there. Well, he rounded out the picture of who we were and what we were doing. I was a journalism student at the time at Cal State Los Angeles, and it was the first time I'd seen a Mexican Spanish surname byline on stories about the community in which I'd grown up. He had a rise within the journalism profession in terms of his news career. He's sent to Santo Domingo in 1965. To cover some things that were going on in terms of disruptions there in the Dominican Republic. Then to the Vietnam War. He covers the Vietnam War at a time when that was the biggest story nationally and internationally in the United States. And then he's made the Mexico City bureau chief for the Los Angeles Times. And the idea of having a Mexican-born, he was born in Juarez, Mexico, raised in El Paso, having a Mexican-born, Mexican-American representing a very white, very Anglo newspaper at that time was really a breakthrough. He covers Mexico City through the mid to late 60s during Tlatelolco, the riots and massacre that occurred just before the 1968 Olympics. And at the same time that that's happening, things are changing in East LA and in the Chicano community. We have the massive school walkouts in 1968 here in LA, the Brown Berets, the growth of the farm workers movement and all this. He comes back to LA in 1969, basically called back to where the beat he had left, but it's a much bigger story now. And that's when I met him and got to know him. I was doing basically press relations for pickets, demonstrations, marches, sit-ins and such that students were holding at that time. And he had to come into a way of looking at the community differently than he had before. There had not been the Brown Berets, there hadn't been student activism, there hadn't been people confronting the system when he left it. And he does that for the LA Times for a year, does a good job, gets connected, and then just leaves it for the Spanish-speaking station, as you heard him saying in the interview, that he just felt, I've been writing about my people, now I want to write for my people. He covers, and he finds it's very different covering for a Spanish station than for an English station. At one time, he was covering a school demonstration in Roosevelt High School in East LA, and the LAPD, the police department, actually came up and put their hands in front of the camera of his camera crew because they didn't want to photograph the police who were basically hitting the students who were trying to walk out peacefully in protest. He covers the demonstration, as you so well described, and then the uprising and disturbances that follow on August 29th, following a peaceful march against the war, and then is killed by a sheriff's deputy. This is the front page of the Los Angeles Times 40 years ago today. It says there's a furor, that there's still mysteries, there's still questions that have not been answered about why he was killed or how he was killed. This is just, right after it happened.